This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with hosts Ben Pratt. Thanks for joining us.
Their brains are going to be exhausted, and an exhausted brain doesn't have the capacity to regulate itself. And so the emotional centers in the brain are going to start kind of directing that behavior, and basically that brain's not going to have the self-discipline. Say, you know what, guys, let's say stop, I need to go and work out.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Fit to Succeed show. I am privileged today to have with me a professional who works in the field of performance coaching. He's also a neuroscientist and in the past a personal trainer. He is Marcel Daane. Marcel, nice to have you here today.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's a privilege to be able to bring you onto the show, because I've had the opportunity to sit and listen to you presenting in the past, and I know you've got a great perspective on things that I'd like to bring to the listeners.
Perfect. Yeah, it's I've been coined an out-of-the-box thinker many times in my career. So I do like to look at things from a different perspective and see how we can approach things differently rather than always just kind of following the norm. Right? You know,
exactly. And today, hopefully, we're going to do a little bit of that, Marcel. So
sure.
Perhaps we could begin by, if I could invite you perhaps to share what motivated you to become a fitness professional years ago, and how you decided that this was the right direction. Because as I understand, you were a fair ways on in your life before you became a personal trainer.
Yeah, I was well into my 20s. So before I became a personal trainer, I was actually in the military. So I served in the military for about 10 years, and just like many veterans in the military, when you leave the military, adjusting to civilian life can be quite a challenge. And there was one area where I felt I could kind of contribute to society and actually function in society, and that was by being physically active. That was something that was, kind of stayed with me within the military, and so I ended up getting a job at Gold's Gym in the Netherlands. I'm actually originally Dutch, so it was it was a Gold's Gym at a little town called Nieuwegein, near a town called Utrecht, if anybody's listening, mm-hmm. And because I think it's still there actually after 30 years. But yeah, so I started off there as a floor trainer. I had no certifications, I had no education. I was, in the military, you don't learn all of that kind of stuff. So I started off as a floor trainer, cleaning mirrors, doing the laundry, all of that stuff. Kind of stuff, doing all the fun stuff. And the funny thing is that the owner's wife was a physiotherapist, and there was one of her patients had been in a car accident, and she actually asked me if I could support that patient with some of the fitness work that patient required. And back then he had a pretty severe back injury, and it was actually during one of our sessions that he got up for the very first time out of his wheelchair, and that was such an impactful moment for both of us. For him, of course, being able to actually get up out of that wheelchair and stand on his own 2 feet, and so you can imagine him. He's crying, I'm crying, and we're both having one of those kind of biblical moments. And it was right then and there that I knew what I was meant to do on this planet, and that was really to help other people become a better version of themselves, no matter where they are in their lives. That was so profound for me, and that inspired and motivated me to continue my education. I actually in that same time I ended up moving to Singapore. I got a job out here working in the fitness industry, and then went back to school while I was working, and completed the degree in complementary medicine, really specializing in movement therapy and applied nutrition. Mm-hmm. And after I completed that degree, I actually ended up working in the hospital system in Singapore as a health and wellness counselor, working with people with chronic disease, cancer patients, diabetes, heart disease, all of those kind of things. And was
that purely in that? Were you doing that full time, or were you still personal training and doing that on
I
the
was
side?
Still doing some personal training on the side as well. Yeah. So, but I became increasingly more fascinated with the with the process of behavior change. And that was what really sparked me to become a personal trainer, was that desire to help people change their behavior for the better, right? And provide them with tools that are going to help them be successful, no matter what they're doing in life. And I used personal training really as a metaphor, to create great life lessons. And and it was in the consulting and the coaching area where I really discovered, the complexity of behavior change. And that fascinated me so much that I started to tinker with neuroscience, and I ended up doing a master's degree in neuroscience and leadership. In the meanwhile, I'd also opened my own gym, which I did on the side as well, which is a strength conditioning facility. Still exists here in Singapore. It's called Speed Institute. And it's all built around helping kids feel like they can be athletes, giving them all the mental and physical tools, to be the best that they can be as athletes. And that grew from kids to also adults, which was quite funny. And it was actually in that environment where I became more and more introduced to the adults, who also happened to be, a lot of them were business owners, CEOs, people like that. And they started to ask me if I could do stuff with their teams, with their people, and discovered a whole new industry in terms of executive coaching. And so I took my neuroscience studies and I actually started specializing in leadership, especially with regards to self-leadership in terms of how you manage and regulate yourself. What are the right mindsets in terms of, setting yourself up for success. And I ended up graduating from that in 2014. And while I was doing that research, I was inspired to write a book based on my research. And what I actually researched, neuroscience is very much, of course, a kind of a shoulders up approach, right? Everything's about the brain, right? Understandably. And of course, coming from the fitness industry, as well as from the healthcare industry, I had a much better understanding of that. Everything's holistic and everything's connected.
And fitness is everything from the neck down, usually.
That's right. When you look at the fitness industry, that tends to be a neck down approach. And I found that too very interesting. So what I ended up doing is I kind of created two pathways. I have the executive coaching pathway, where I teach executives that they actually have a body attached to their brain. And that body is responsible for providing the brain with nutrients and fuel and all of that kind of stuff to make that brain function. And of course, their brain is what makes the money, so protecting that brain is critical. And then in the fitness industry, I developed an education program that helps trainers understand that there is a head above those shoulders, and that head has emotions and feelings and and all of these kind of things, and that can either help a client, but it can generally speaking, that's actually what holds the client back. And so how does that trainer manage the client's brain, and how can we actually train that client's brain and set that brain up for success so that they can really kind of apply themselves in the best way possible and get the most out of each training session.
Well, you touched on something really fascinating there, Marcel. I hope you don't mind me interrupting. And that is this idea, obviously you've gone and you've done this neuroscience and leadership study. And that's obviously changed your own perspective on a number of things. But
that's right.
How did that information that you had change the way that you coached your clients? How did that alter your approach?
Well, I mean, it's I think one of the greatest things that I really learned is that we're not always in control of our brain. More often than not, we're the victim of our own brain, and that's known as bottoms-up processing. So when
can you
we
give an example of that to help us?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we are driven by our emotional brains, when we behave emotionally, when we give in to temptation, right? And all of those kind of things, that is an emotional impulse. Feeling frustrated, for example, and behaving frustrated are two different things. And when the behavior results based on how you feel, that is driven by what we call the limbic system, which is the emotional center in the brain, and that drives a lot of that behavior. And a lot of that comes from the the ability of the prefrontal cortex, which is the, kind of the regulatory part of the brain, if it's incapable of regulating that emotional brain, then the brain runs havoc. And that's when people aren't able to regulate themselves. They don't have necessarily that self-discipline, to do what they need to do to be successful in their fitness and all of these kind of things. And in the past, I used to, as a personal trainer, I had my times too where I had expectations of my clients, and I had ideas of things of what I felt that they should be doing to to become the best version of themselves. Where from learning and understanding neuroscience, everybody's brain is wired differently. And not all brains are set up for success. Not all brains are wired in the right way to be able to apply themselves. And I call that capacity. So that's the capacity of the brain to apply itself in the best way possible.
Okay.
And there are a lot of people out there simply don't have the capacity. When they live a life that's, that's full of stress and they don't get enough sleep, and they're, and they have, 3 or 4 kids running around, and, when they get home and they're exhausted all the time, their brains are going to be exhausted, and an exhausted brain doesn't have the capacity to regulate itself. And so the emotional centers in the brain are going to start kind of directing that behavior, and basically that brain's not going to have the self-discipline. Say, you know what, guys, let's say stop, I need to go and work out. And for me, that self-discipline was always quite natural. It was quite normal. And so I never really had that clear understanding, and hence therefore also never really the empathy that I have now for my clients, as I now have a very good understanding of how each client's brain is wired differently. So rather, even before even talking about what they should be doing, I really kind of have a conversation on whether or not they have the capacity to do what they would like to do, or what we would like them to do, and that's a very fair question to ask your client. Is it that are you ready? Do you have that capacity, to apply yourself differently? Because that's going to cost you energy, and do you have that energy reserve? So in my research, what I really wanted to study is, where is that energy reserve, and can we measure that energy reserve in the brain? And the truth is, yes, we can.
So is that a bit like, I've heard other experts in this sort of field talk about that willpower is a finite reserve, and that there's only so much of it we can draw upon on each day. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That's right. I mean, the less energy reserve that you have in the brain, the less capacity you're going to have to be able to apply willpower. And willpower comes from various different areas in that prefrontal cortex. Like, for example, there's on the right side of your brain, the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal cortex. And these are little areas in the brain that require energy to be able to function. And when they can't function, when they don't get the energy they need, they don't get the oxygenation, they don't get the glucose, they don't get, all of that kind of stuff, then they just stop functioning. And, and when they stop functioning, then that emotional brain goes, ooh, chocolate cake, let's do it, right? And then there's no regulatory effect that it kind of says, oh, no, that's probably not in my best interest right now. And that's where a lot of people struggle. And so what I wanted to do in my research is I wanted to see, is that measurable? Can we, as fitness professionals, for example, say to our client, listen, this is where the energy is for you in your brain, and this is where it needs to be for you to be able to be successful. And of course, there was nothing like that out there in the world, and me being that out-of-the-box thinker kind of went, hey, listen, I think this is really relevant, not just for the fitness industry, but really kind of for anybody. And so I started doing research on developing an assessment that actually helps us measure that. And that assessment is a 2-part assessment. It's a questionnaire where people are just asked questions about how they feel, how they behave, but also ask questions about sleep habits, about stress levels, about anxiety, depression, but also their exercise habits. So all of these all of the factors, that the variables, so to speak, that could influence capacity in the brain. And then once they're done with that questionnaire, then they do some cognitive tests. And so basically it's like doing a 1 rep maximum for bench press. We got to be able to do a kind of a 1 rep maximum for the brain as well. So it's making the brain do a series of sprints and exercises And these are very highly validated cognitive tests.
Right.
And so we can measure them against different age groups. So what I ended up coming up with was an assessment that measures what we call brain age.
Mm-hmm.
So, is your brain performing at a certain age versus your chronological age? It's kind of like having a fitness age, right? That's also quite popular.
Mm-hmm.
As this is your actual age, this is your fitness age. And so we can do the same thing with the brain as well. So my assessment does that. Yeah. So it says, hey, listen, your brain is kind of functioning as at a 70-year-old brain right now, and do you think that 70-year-old brain is going to have the capacity to be able to learn these new habits and new behaviors and have the self-discipline to get into the gym multiple times a week and all of these kind of things? And of course, the answer to that is no. So what is that?
Is that the free assessment, Marcel, that's on your website?
No, that's actually just a tester. So that's it's basically a 10. Well, so there's a free assessment that you can do, which is just a 10-question questionnaire, kind of similar, and that kind of shows how balanced you are in terms of being able to apply yourself in all of these kinds of. So it's a great little tester, but the full-fledged assessment is you also then get a 22-page report that lays out everything about your brain function and your wellness levels and all of that kind of stuff.
So I'm not surprised that you're so thorough.
It is extreme, but it has to be, right? So now at least when I start working with my clients, they undergo that assessment. And what we can do with that is we can measure that energy reserve in the brain. We can really kind of say, hey, listen, this is where your capacity is right now. And if your capacity is that of a 70-year-old and you're only 28, then chances are I can tell you everything that you need to do with regards to diet, but you're not going to apply it anyway. So, right, because you don't have the capacity to do so. So let's focus on bringing that brain age down. Let's focus on raising those energy levels in the brain, and what are some of the things that you can do quickly and easily to start raising those energy levels. And once we start building on that capacity, then we can use that capacity for things like willpower and all of that kind of stuff. And that's where we can really go into the behavior change coaching in terms of people applying themselves differently, And so that's basically what I do.
Yeah. Marcel, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I've seen you speak on a video that you have online about sleep, and there you're talking about energy reserves and brain age, and we have recently written and produced a course called the Sleep Recovery Specialist for Fitness Professionals.
Oh, nice.
And it's made me think about this idea of how sleep potentially has that capacity to energize the brain or drain the brain if people aren't sleeping well. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely, right? So sleep is a critical factor. If we don't sleep well, we die, right? So we either die slowly, right, or we die really fast. If you try not to sleep for 10 days, you're going to die. So sleep is a critical factor for your brain. What a lot of people don't understand, though, is that how not just about how much sleep, but also about the quality of your sleep. Yeah. And what are the things that you might need to do? What are some of the habits and rituals that you might need to do to get yourself to be able to have the highest quality sleep possible, and how that's then going to fuel your brain. Just think about it, like while you're sleeping, hormone production, for example, growth hormones. I'm not sure you guys cover that all in the course, is critical for recovery, and recovery is critical for resilience, and resilience is what builds a body. As we do weight training, for example, I remember asking my daughter this, and she actually just told me that my daughter's a Division I athlete in university now.
Oh, wow, cool.
And and she's she was just telling me the other day how she remembered that when she was 6 years old, she would run to her friends and say, hey, when you exercise, do you build your body up or do you break it down? And this is a 6-year-old kid, right? And she loved asking that question because she knew that all the kids, well, of course you build your body up when you exercise. She goes, no, you don't. You break it down, right? Because you build it up when you recover, right? How do you recover? You sleep, you eat well, you do all of these kind of things. That's your recovery. And she loved, she hated listening to me, but she listened anyway. And then she'd apply that with her friends, apparently, which is quite funny. But the interesting thing about that is that recovery is critical in resilience. And as
sorry, Marcel, because as you've raised that topic of resilience, I don't mean to cut you off midstream there, but could you explain your definition of what that means to have resilience or be resilient?
Yeah, I mean, basically the definition is bounce back ability. So your ability to bounce back from whatever it is that you subject yourself to. You know, if you know, and the more resilient that you are, the less impact that event is going to have on you, right? You know, so the same counts with exercise. As you build strength and endurance, you become more resilient to, you know, further forms of training and exercise and all of that kind of stuff. You start feeling less muscle ache and all of that. You suffer less, right? You know, which is part of that resilience. So what that means too is that there is physical resilience, right, or physiological resilience, that our tissues actually become stronger as we are put under stress on a regular basis, permitting there's enough recovery, right? If there's not enough recovery, then we don't, and then that kind of chips away. That's when we create overtraining or burnout or things like that, right? But permitting that we recover well, then those tissues grow stronger. But it's also about psychological resilience, right? You know, so that ability to be able to see a stressor and what may cause anxiety at one point in your life, but you've repeatedly exposed yourself to it to a point where you're like, hey, I can do this. You know, you convince yourself that you have the ability to overcome it, you know, then that makes you psychologically more resilient. So
I mean, for me, that's fascinating because I think a lot of clients, when they're new to a fitness environment or they're trying to get into training, I think a lot of the challenge is actually the mental resilience, the lack of mental resilience that they can apply themselves to physical conditioning, not so much the physical problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's the brain that drives the body, right? You know, so even when people, and this is something that I teach in my instructor trainings as well. If you think, for example, about doing a push-up, right? And you put a person in a push-up position with their arms straight looking at the ground. If that person is completely new to exercise, has probably never done a push-up before, the first thought that's going to enter their mind is that they're going to fall flat on their face and they're going to embarrass themselves, right? You know, and the moment that fight or flight response happens, right, the body locks up, right? So you can't move freely. So you're as a trainer, you might already be setting your client up for failure, you know, rather than for success, right? Because that mental resilience hasn't happened yet until that person comes to a conclusion like, hey, I can do this. And then all of a sudden the body starts moving freely, right? You know, so there is a direct link between a person's emotions and that emotional and psychological resilience and how the body actually moves, right? And that's a constant feedback loop. And so a lot of even movement patterns that we might see in our clients are actually restricted, not because of, you know, mechanical imbalances, but actually because there's a psycho/emotional component there that we might be overlooking, right? You know, and so we have to be, you know, kind of very, very in tune with how that brain and that body function together and how that actually works together in order for us to be able to actually get our clients to move in the way that, of course, we would want them to be able to move so they can really enjoy that physical movement in the best way possible, right? You know, and so
could you give an example then, Marcel, of how we might support a client to build that mental resilience to apply themselves to exercise?
Yeah. Absolutely. So a great exercise is something I do in my training. So going back to a push-up, for example, you know, I very often throw into my group and I'll say, listen, how many of you can do a one-arm push-up? Right? You know, and there might be in a whole class, there might be one or two people say, oh, I can do it, you know, but other than that, most people say, listen, everybody can do it. Right? And in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to teach you how to do a one-arm push-up and you're all going to be able to do a one-arm push-up. Would you like to learn that? And everyone's like, yes. And so what I do is I walk them to the wall and I let them push themselves away from the wall with one arm. I said, there, you're doing a one-arm push-up. I didn't tell you that I wanted you to do a one-arm push-up from the ground. You told yourself that because that was the image that you were projecting in your mind of how difficult that would be, right? And the moment that you create that mental barrier in your own mind, that's when, you know, you start getting that resistance. You know, that's when you start telling yourself you can't do something.
Right.
As where what we can do as trainers is we can help people look at things different ways, and we can help them kind of look at different perspectives and say, hey, you know what, I can do this. This is a one-arm push-up off the wall, so I can do that. Great. And so we know that from a mindset perspective, that people who can focus on the things they can do have a greater tendency for success than people who focus on the things they can't do. So that's that psychological resilience that you really want to talk about, is your ability to change that thinking and those emotional responses in the clients for them to just always be able to go, yeah, I can do this. I got this.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea of finding where they're successful and then helping build more success from that point, rather than identifying what they are lacking and trying to solve that.
Exactly. Because when we talk about what they're lacking, where they're weak, what they're doing wrong, all of these kind of things, we're not building them for success. We're basically showing them that they're failures, right? It doesn't build confidence, and it doesn't build a desire for lifelong practice, and so I think that is one of the kind of errors in traditional personal training, is we have this tendency to kind of spend too much attention on on what is wrong and what is and be almost too militant in our own demands of the client, rather than actually being more accepting and helping that client think more out of the box and be more accepting of their own bodies and how their own bodies work, and let them feel that success, how small it might be, and let them celebrate that, and then take that success from there and then roll with that and slowly but surely add on to that. That's going to create a much kind of a healthier lifelong habit of regular exercise.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, it'll help to build motivation and confidence when you do that, rather than helping them see where they're lacking. I totally agree. Now, that's one of the aspects there that potentially that leads to this question, which is, how can we help fitness trainers understand that thinking outside the box, as we began this discussion, thinking differently to the norm, may be an essential part of their own success?
I think personally, this sounds really interesting, but a number of years ago, I was actually in Taiwan, and I had just happened to have coffee with the then CEO of a large retail chain, global retail chain, and he had just taken over a couple of years. And for the first time in 10 years, this retail chain started making profit. And so my question to him was, well, what did you change? Right? He says, what's really interesting? He says, when I came into the company as CEO, I discovered that the company ran upside down. It focused on tools first, right? Then developed processes that support the tools, and then had to shape the people to be able to work those processes, right? And as he was saying that, he says, that's upside down. He says the people are the most important thing. He says it's people first, right? Then you create processes that support the people, right? And then you build tools that help them in those processes to be successful. And he says, all I did was flip it upside down. And as he was talking, I was thinking, what? The fitness industry is exactly the same. The fitness industry is very tool oriented.
It is. Yeah.
It is whether, whatever the tool might be, but we as fitness professionals have a tendency to walk into a gym and look at the tools and then say, what can I do with that? So I think tools first, then I think processes. What can I do with that? And then my client walks in and they say, listen, I'm going to make you adapt to that tool by following this process. And ultimately that doesn't work. We can't shape everybody. There's no one size fits all. Every individual is uniquely different. So I think that we should kind of go back to the basics, right? Is people first. Focus on the person. What is it that the person needs and what is it that the person wants, right? Look at how they move, look at their challenges, look at all their mindsets, all of these kind of things, and say, what is it that you really need? Then develop a process based on what that person needs. This is the process that you need that's going to help you get to where you want to go. Then you look and say, okay, now where are my tools? What tools can help me? That's right, because you can't use a screwdriver for every single process, and you gotta only use the screwdriver when you need a screwdriver. And I think that this industry is kind of flipped upside down as well, and we focus way too much on the tools first before we can really kind of focus on the people. And I think for the future of the fitness industry and for the success of our clients, we need to become people first, and look at the person first, and then from there, people, process, then tools.
Fascinating. That's a fascinating point. And it leads me to my final question, all right, which is, if you were able to go back in time to your mid to late 20s when you became a personal trainer, and you could give yourself 3 to 5 words of advice, what would you tell yourself, knowing what you now know?
That's a really, really good question. I think what I would tell myself is one area where I got it wrong as a fitness professional was the fact that I underestimated the need for business intelligence.
Okay.
Yeah. So every practitioner out there, right, wants to be a practitioner, and I really wanted to be able to help my clients. But in order for us to be able to get clients, we have to be able to earn clients. And so there are what I like to call the 3 forms of intelligence that are required for a successful personal training business. And those forms of intelligence is number 1, business intelligence. Know your numbers, know your marketing, know your branding, know your, kind of do what you need to do from a business perspective, just like any other business, because otherwise you're not going to land a single client, and therefore you can't be that change maker that you want to be.
Yeah, you can't showcase your skills if you don't have a client in the first place.
That's right. The second is operational intelligence, knowing what to do and how to do it, and to be able to do that really well. And then the third one is emotional intelligence, is understanding relationships and understanding the client at an emotional level. And I will tell you, after many years of being in this industry, I think most personal trainers tend to struggle with the business intelligence, and many struggle with the emotional intelligence because they're so focused on what are the tools that I need to be focused on, what are the processes, what are the so they become very task oriented with
very operational. Yeah.
They become very operational rather than business and emotional intelligence. So for me, when I became a practitioner, I hated the whole business thing. I didn't want to get involved in that. I was very resistant to it. I said, that's not for me and stuff like that. And so for many years as a fitness professional, I struggled to make ends meet, right? And so if I knew then what I know now was don't just invest education and time and money on being operational, but also invest that time and energy and money in terms of business intelligence and emotional intelligence, because those are equally important, and your business will be successful.
Yeah, that's a really great point to end on. Marcel, it's been a fascinating discussion. We've covered a lot of areas, and I really appreciate your time and your expertise after a long time in this industry and exploring lots of different avenues of the industry. I found that really fascinating. So thank you so much for giving us some time.
You're most welcome.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.